What's on the agenda today? Ah, that's right. Awards. They are something that affects our perception of art. Even if we try to stop those biases from entering our mind, when you see something has won an award, especially if it's an older and more prestigious one, akin to something like an Oscar, you start to interact with it differently. You now have to forcefully remove a bias, thus already interacting with the work differently than you would have if you had not known about this award. For better and worse, they define how people look at a piece of work. The Hugo Awards are one such case, probably the most well known literary award there is, akin to the Oscars, and that you probably recognize the name alone, even if you do not interact with them at all. It probably goes without saying that the biggest and most known Hugo given out each year is for Best Novel. The first of these was given in 1953 to a book called The Demolished Man. This is the book I will be reviewing today. I had a curiosity in me to find out if the first Hugo Award winner lived up to that prestigious name. Welcome to A Skeleton's Library. Today, I will tell you whether the first Hugo Award winner holds up. In a world policed by telepaths, Ben Reich plans to commit a crime that hasn't been heard of in 70 years. Murder. That's the only option left for Reich, whose company is losing a 10-year death struggle with rival DeCourtney Enterprises. Terrorized in his dreams by the man with no face, driven to the edge after DeCourtney refuses a merger offer, Reich murders his rival and bribes a high-ranking telepath to help him cover his tracks. But while police prefect Lincoln Powell knows Reich is guilty, his telepath's knowledge is a far cry from admissible evidence. The summary of The Demolished Man serves it well. It immediately grabbed me, presenting this alternate reality that was close enough to ours to be immediately invested in, and different enough to be immediately intrigued. It also sets up an interesting premise, and goes so far as to give away that Reich does murder someone, and Powell knows he's guilty. He knows that this setup is not what makes the book compelling. At last, while the summary knows this, the book struggles a fair bit more. It shines at most when it's showcasing how having a class of telepaths would affect society, seeing the way the telepath guide acts and grows almost like a cult, how telepathy does not actually make up for lack of evidence, and how those without powers react and adjust. The telepaths are what makes this book interesting. The actual plot of Reich coming up with how to get away with murder in this society and the subsequent cat and mouse game is disappointingly simple. Reich lives in this society without crime, where your thoughts can be read, and his plan of murder is mainly just sneak into his room and shoot him. He even mentions that he'll leave a lot up to instincts, as that's harder to predict. I do appreciate some details of this plot, such as Reich getting a catchy song stuck in his head as a form of mental block against telepaths. The most well done part of the actual murder storyline is just how chaotic the murder ends up being. It feels like one of the more realistic parts of the book. No matter how much you plan, it mostly just ends up in this chaotic, animalistic struggle where things go wrong. I also enjoy how quickly Reich messes up. He almost immediately gives himself away to Powell by accidentally throwing in a detail only the killer would know. The back and forth of Reich covering his tracks as the police lay out their traps and bait was fun and engaging, but it really does not feel like it lasts that long before getting to the endgame point it devolves. Other than that, it's a fairly by-the-number pulp story, made slightly more interesting by being in this alternate world. And it's also interesting as a sort of precursor to genres like cyberpunk. The book also takes plenty from its pulp origins, a lot of it being over the top. I was not expecting to read a line, "Together we could rape the universe," in the first Hugo Award winner. There's also just funny, cartoon level stuff like Rex Ancestor, just having a book that gives tips on how to get away with murder in this society. It really is a cartoon villain-ass bloodline. By far, the worst part of this book is the horrible attempt at a love story. Not only is it poorly done and unrealistic, it's fucking weird. You have this character who gets mentally reduced to a baby, who Powell then helps nurture and mentally guide back to her previous adult state, all as a way to help her get over the trauma of witnessing her father's murder. So you have scenes of her acting like an infant and calling Powell Dada, followed up by his friend Mary, making him realize that he loves her. This mentally infant girl, who he has not spoken to in any real way, and has only met like a couple weeks ago. She does get back to her normal adult mindset, but she also remembers all that baby stuff and treating him like her dad as well. That's also pretty much her whole character. She escapes from the murder scene, is so traumatized that she's babyfied for a while, and then she's just in love with Powell. Women in this book are barely poorly written. There's about 3 of them. While they're all barely characters, so are the men, so I can't judge too harshly. They are also, however, just mainly used as love interests. Duffy for Reich, Mary and Barbara for Powell. Besides that, they are just used to uncover something essential for the plot. Mary really only exists to be lovesick and confront Powell to get him to admit his feelings for Barbara. Barbara only exists to show Powell what happened the night of the murder. Duffy honestly only really exists to give Reich the catchy song and be poked fun at for being promiscuous. Even for a book full of surface level characters, the women feel the most lifeless, just tools for the plot, and for 2 main males to have people fawn over them. To go to the 2 main characters, it's pretty much the most generic crime story personalities you can come up with. The Citizen Kane-esque businessman who thinks he can get away with everything, who has no idea the real source of his issues isn't money, but that his daddy didn't love him. Then the charismatic star cop who's ready to sacrifice himself, sees the good in people, and has women falling left and right for him. There's just nothing there to chew on, and it's honestly a shame, because there are hints of it. Hal not wanting to marry, and then falling in love with a normal person would have been an interesting point of conflict with the eugenics of the telepath. Instead, the story not only just isn't really interested in poking through and criticizing the telepath guide, but the story solution to this is, oh, she loves you, so she will stay with you even if you don't marry her. It just turns something that could be interesting and thoughtful into something pathetic and sad. Then there's Reich. The story completely tries to insert that Reich is charming and does have a conscience, but this is not really showcased. In fact, Reich is insanely unlikable. He's just an egomaniac asshole. You do not see any positive traits of him at all, really. My most good faith interpretation of this is that it's mostly presented from the side of Powell, so due to his telepathic nature, he just naturally feels the good in anybody. I wish the novel would have expanded on Reich a bit though. It would have been nice to see him have more charm or a conscience, to actively struggle with what he is doing rather than just acting like an asshole the whole time. And it's just in his subconscious that we don't see where he feels guilty and wants to punish himself. There's also this potential dynamic with Powell and Reich that is hinted at but never really expanded on. It takes all these things that could have made a great crime story and just never really goes anywhere with them. Then it's also an interesting sci-fi reality that just never really expands enough to fully draw you in. It feels like a half step into each genre rather than fully plunging into them and exploring. The foundation is there, but no one bothered to finish the building. There is one creative technique that Bester employs in this that feels unique and not by the number though. His use of topography layout to showcase how the telepaths talk to each other is great and very effective. Showing the confusing jumble of thoughts when there's a bunch of them, and then the pattern they establish to communicate easier is genuinely great. I would say it is the most creatively nourishing part of the novel. I do think some conversations in the book can be confusing and hard to follow, as Bester really does not specify who is talking a lot. For the telepathic conversations, I do feel that is the intended purpose though. The ending of The Demolished Man also feels a bit messy to me. Reich continues to unravel, getting away with his crime, but ultimately destroying himself. A tale as old as time. And then he's suddenly mentioned to be like this world level threat that all the telepaths need to come together to defeat by channeling their mental energy through Powell. It's a pretty insane jump stakes wise, and then of course, it's pretty easily handled. Powell just puts Reich in a mental fantasy that destroys him and walks away fine, saving the world and gain to live happily with his not wife. The most interesting part of the ending is learning about Demolition more and their comments on why they rebuild criminals like Rake instead. That these people clearly aren't sheep and thus above the norm and can be turned and used for good. It feels like a precursor to something like Psychopaths. The book then ends on an oddly optimistic note. It does not feel relevant or earned. I imagine you can guess my answer to the question. Does the first Hugo Award winner hold up? No, I don't think it does. That does not mean it doesn't have any worth, but it really feels like a product of its time, rather than something timeless. A stepping stone that then led to the creation of better things. It feels by the numbers and like a missed opportunity. A story whose ideas have been more fully realized in other works. If you want a story about an egomaniac businessman with abandonment issues, I would recommend Citizen Kane, which came out a decade before The Demolished Man. If you wanted a crime procedural in a sci-fi setting where crime is nearly impossible, I would recommend Psychopath Season 1. I know I've probably sounded pretty harsh in this video, but I do think this is just a very middle of the road novel, rather than a straight up bad one. I would say read this novel if you are interested in literary history. It's a book immortalized in time due to its status as the first best novel Hugo Award winner, for better and worse. For that fact alone, I'm glad I took the time to read this. This concludes my thoughts on A Demolished Man. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.